Hi guys. Tonight we're stepping quietly into a frozen night from the year 1268, where a medieval monastery stands beneath a sky of sharp winter stars. Have you ever wondered how people slept before warm houses, electric blankets, and perfectly controlled rooms? Imagine walking through a stone doorway as icy air brushes your face, while the candle flames tremble against ancient walls and a distant wind whispers across the empty fields. Inside this monastery, monks prepare for a night where warmth is precious and silence is part of survival. So, before you settle into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe and tell us where you are listening from and your local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights and you step slowly into the cold evening world of a medieval monastery. The first thing you notice is the silence, not a complete silence, because the monastery is still alive with small movements, but a deep and gentle quiet that feels completely different from the busy sounds of the modern world. Your footsteps touch the worn stone floor, and the sound travels farther than you expect through the dark corridors, somewhere nearby. A wooden door closes carefully. A small fire crackles, the smell of smoke, old timber, and warm bread drifts through the cold air. You are entering a place built for discipline, prayer, and endurance. A monastery in the year 1268 is not simply a collection of rooms where religious men live. It is a carefully organised community where every hour has a purpose. The monks follow a daily pattern shaped by religious traditions, agricultural work, study, and the changing seasons. Winter does not stop their routines. It simply changes the way every task feels. Outside the thick walls, the frozen landscape stretches into darkness. The fields are quiet because crops are resting beneath the cold earth. Trees stand bare against the wind. The paths surrounding the monastery have become hard and uneven from repeated freezing. You can almost feel the cold travelling across the ground, climbing towards the buildings that shelter everyone inside. The monastery walls are strong, but they are not magical barriers against winter. Cold air finds small openings, wind slips beneath doors. Stone absorbs the freezing temperature and slowly releases it into the rooms. Medieval people understood this reality very well because they experienced it every year. Their comfort came not from escaping winter completely, but from adapting carefully. The monks preparing for sleep tonight have already spent many hours working. Some have copied manuscripts by candlelight. Some have cared for animals. Some have prepared food. And others have maintained the monastery buildings. Their lives are often imagined as peaceful and slow, but peaceful does not mean effortless. A medieval monk could experience long hours of physical and mental work before finally resting. As evening approaches, you notice the changing atmosphere. The monastery becomes darker as daylight disappears behind the winter clouds. Candles become more important. Their warm glow creates small circles of light surrounded by shadows. The flames move gently whenever someone walks nearby, almost as if the building itself is breathing. The main sleeping area is not a private bedroom like many people know today. Most monks sleep together in a shared dormitory. This arrangement provides practical advantages because one large room is easier to manage and supervise than many separate spaces. It also reflects the communal nature of monastic life. Historians know from surviving monastery plans and written rules that many medieval religious communities organized sleeping spaces carefully. Beds were usually simple, and privacy was limited. However, historians still argue whether every monastery followed the same sleeping arrangements because practices changed between different religious communities and regions. You move closer to the sleeping hall and notice the smell of wool blankets and old wood. The air is colder here. The stone walls hold the memory of the winter day, and the floor feels hard beneath your feet. A few monks are already preparing their places for the night. Their beds are not luxurious. There are no soft mattresses, no thick modern pillows, and no heated rooms waiting for them. Instead, they rely on layers, wool clothing, simple bedding, and shared body warmth help create enough comfort to rest. Survival often comes from many small choices rather than one dramatic solution. A curious detail from medieval life is that some people believed sleeping positions and nighttime habits could influence health and spiritual balance. These ideas were connected to medieval understandings of the human body, which were very different from modern science. People searched for meaning in ordinary actions, including something as simple as lying down. The monks are not thinking about comfort in the way you might think about it today. They are not expecting perfect warmth. They are expecting a normal winter night. Their definition of comfort is different because their entire world is different. The cold reminds you that history is not only about kings, battles, and grand events. Sometimes history is hidden in ordinary moments. A person pulling a blanket closer, someone placing another piece of wood near a fire, a tired worker finally closing their eyes after a long day. The monastery continues settling into darkness. The final tasks are completed. Voices become quieter. The smell of the evening meal slowly fades from the halls. Outside, the wind grows stronger, moving around the stone walls like a patient visitor that refuses to leave. You stand there for a moment and imagine living in this place. The night feels long, but not empty. It is filled with small sounds, familiar routines, and quiet determination. These monks are not fighting winter with powerful tools. They are meeting it with habits passed down through generations. Soon, the candles will burn lower. The dormitory will grow darker, hundreds of years before modern bedrooms and central heating. People will close their eyes in this frozen monastery and trust the walls around them. The winter night begins, the monastery grows quieter as the evening settles deeper into the frozen night. And you begin to notice that silence here is not simply the absence of sound. It is something carefully created, something practiced through years of routine and devotion. Every movement has a reason, every hour has its place. The monks do not drift randomly through their days because their entire community is built around a steady rhythm. You walk through the monastery corridors and feel the difference between the outside world and this enclosed space. The wind still presses against the walls, but inside there is order. The cold remains present, yet it is surrounded by human effort. A small flame, a thick garment, a warm meal, and a familiar prayer all become important pieces of survival. Medieval monasteries were often designed around a central courtyard, with important rooms connected by covered walkways. This design helped communities function during every season, including harsh winters when travelling outside became difficult. The arrangement allowed monks to move between sleeping areas, kitchens, chapels, and workspaces while being protected from the worst weather. You pass beneath stone arches that have witnessed countless winters. The walls are not decorated with the bright colours and comforts that many modern buildings contain. Instead, they are practical and serious. Their purpose is not to impress you with luxury. Their purpose is to shelter a community that depends on cooperation. The people living here understand that winter changes everything. Food must be stored carefully. Clothing must last longer. Firewood becomes a valuable resource. Even the smallest tasks become connected to survival. A person carrying a basket of wood is not simply completing a chore. They're helping everyone sleep a little warmer. You hear the quiet sounds of preparation throughout the monastery. Wooden bowls are placed away, a door closes slowly to prevent unnecessary drafts. Someone walks across the floor carrying supplies for the next morning. The sounds are gentle, but they reveal a community still working even as night approaches. The daily life of a medieval monk was structured around religious services known as the hours of prayer. These moments divided the day and night into specific periods of worship. Some prayers happened during darkness, meaning monks could be awakened from sleep to gather together before returning to their beds. You might find this strange, just as you begin to imagine finally resting beneath a blanket. A bell could call people back into the cold corridors, yet for medieval monks, this was not considered an interruption. It was part of the purpose of their lives. The bell becomes one of the most important sounds of the monastery. It controls time in a world without clocks in every room. The sound travels across the buildings and fields, telling everyone when to work, eat, pray, and rest. Historians still debate how strictly every monastery followed these schedules during extreme weather, because written rules often describe ideals rather than everyday reality. A community facing illness, shortages, or severe storms may have adjusted routines in ways that official documents never recorded. You notice small signs that the monks are preparing their bodies for sleep. Some remove outer clothing while keeping warmer layers nearby. Others arrange their bedding carefully because the temperature will continue falling through the night. There is no simple action that defeats the cold. Instead, there is preparation. The monastery teaches patience. You cannot command warmth to appear instantly. You cannot close your eyes and expect the stone walls to become comfortable. You must work with what you have. This way of thinking shaped medieval life. People depended heavily on their surroundings and learned to understand seasonal changes. Winter was not just a colder version of another season. It was a different environment requiring different decisions. A curious detail from medieval communities is that some monasteries kept special rules about cleanliness and personal belongings, including how sleeping spaces should be maintained. These rules were not only about appearance in crowded dormitories. Organisation helped reduce problems when many people shared one room. You look toward the sleeping hall again and imagine dozens of monks resting nearby. The arrangement may feel unfamiliar, but it also created a sense of companionship. Nobody faced the winter night completely alone. If someone became uncomfortable or needed assistance, others were close by. The shared space also reflected the spiritual ideas behind monastic life. Individual comfort was often considered less important than community discipline. A monk was not meant to build a private world separated from everyone else. The monastery was designed as a collective journey. The smell of burning wood reaches you again. Somewhere nearby, a fire continues glowing. It is not large enough to transform the entire building into a warm retreat. Medieval fireplaces were limited compared with modern heating systems, and large stone rooms could remain chilly even with fires burning. Yet those small sources of warmth mattered enormously. A single flame represented security, a warm corner represented relief, a thick wool blanket represented careful preparation. Outside, the frozen night continues expanding across the countryside. The monastery stands quietly against the darkness, holding its small collection of human comforts inside its walls. You begin to understand that the story of medieval sleep is not really about escaping the cold. It is about adapting to it. These monks did not live in a world where winter could be ignored. They lived in a world where winter was always present, always shaping their choices. The candles grow shorter. The voices become softer. The monastery slowly moves closer toward rest. Soon, the final preparations will end, and the sleeping hall will become the center of this frozen night. For now, the monks remain awake a little longer, following traditions that have guided generations before them. They prepare not only their beds, but their minds, accepting another winter night beneath the ancient stone roof. You leave the quiet corridors behind and move deeper into the heart of the monastery, where every stone, wooden beam, and narrow passage tells a story about survival. The building around you is not simply a shelter from the frozen world outside. It is a carefully planned environment where people have learned to live with darkness, cold, and changing seasons. The winter night of 1268 presses against the monastery walls. Outside, frost covers the ground like a thin layer of glass. The air smells clean and sharp, carrying the scent of frozen earth and distant trees. Inside, the atmosphere is different. You smell smoke from fireplaces, the faint sweetness of stored grain, and the familiar scent of wool clothing worn through long winter days. The monastery itself is a remarkable achievement of medieval engineering. Most religious houses were built with thick stone walls, strong wooden roofs, and carefully arranged rooms. These materials help protect the community from weather, although they could not completely remove the cold. You place your hand against the wall and feel the truth immediately. The stone is cold. It has absorbed the winter air throughout the day and now quietly releases that chill back into the rooms. These walls are powerful, but they are not warm. That may sound surprising. A massive stone building seems like the perfect defense against winter. But medieval builders faced a difficult balance. Thick walls provided strength and protection from wind. Yet stone also held cold temperatures for long periods. The monks understood this reality through experience. They did not expect their buildings to create summer comfort during winter. Instead, they used architecture together with clothing, fire, food, and routine to create a livable environment. You walk beneath a low ceiling and notice how different the rooms feel from one another. Some areas are warmer because they are near kitchens or fireplaces. Others remain colder because they are larger or farther away from sources of heat. The kitchen is often one of the most active places in a medieval monastery, even after evening meals are finished. The warmth from cooking fires can make nearby areas more comfortable. The smell of roasted vegetables, fresh bread, and burning wood remains in the air long after the cooks have finished their work. This warmth is valuable because fuel is not unlimited. Firewood must be gathered, stored, and carefully managed. A monastery cannot waste resources because winter may continue for many months. Historians know that medieval monasteries often owned farmland, forests, and other resources that supported their communities. However, historians still argue whether wealthy monasteries experienced significantly warmer living conditions than smaller religious houses because surviving evidence varies greatly between locations. You continue exploring and notice another important feature of monastery design separation. Different activities happen in different areas. Sleeping, eating, praying, studying, and working each have their own spaces. This organization creates order, but it also helps control daily life. In winter, moving efficiently between rooms becomes especially important. Nobody wants to spend unnecessary time walking through freezing passages. The monastery is not built around individual comfort, it is built around shared purpose. You might imagine a monk having a private bedroom with a comfortable bed and peaceful decorations, but that picture belongs more to later ideas of personal living space. In many medieval communities, shared rooms were normal. A curious detail from medieval architecture is that some monasteries included small features designed to reduce discomfort, such as enclosed walkways and sheltered passages between important buildings. These simple choices could make daily movement easier during cold weather. You step closer to a narrow window and see the darkness outside. The opening is small, designed more for protection than for a wide view. Glass was expensive and limited in many medieval buildings, so windows often allowed cold air to enter more easily than modern windows. A thin draft moves through the room. You feel it immediately. The winter is waiting. The monks respond through preparation. They close shutters when needed. They wear layers. They gather near warmer spaces when possible. Their lives are filled with small adjustments that modern people rarely consider. A person living in 1268 would notice the weather constantly. The temperature affected clothing choices, travel plans, meals, work schedules, and sleeping arrangements. Winter was not background scenery. It was an active force shaping every part of life. You imagine the monastery during the afternoon before this frozen night began. Workers carrying supplies, monks writing near candlelight, animals being cared for, fires being maintained, every action slowly preparing the community for darkness. Now those efforts surround you. The monastery feels like a living machine made from stone, wood, fire, and human cooperation. Each part depends on another. Remove the stored food, and winter becomes dangerous. Remove the firewood, and the nights become harder, remove the shared community, and survival becomes much more difficult. The strength of this place does not come only from its walls, it comes from the people inside. As you continue through the quiet halls, you realize that sleeping in a medieval monastery was not simply an individual experience. It was connected to the entire structure of the community. The warmth beneath a blanket began hours earlier, with someone preparing food, carrying wood, repairing buildings, or maintaining routines. The night grows colder outside. The monastery remains awake just a little longer. Soon, the sleeping hall will fill with quiet breathing. Soon, candles will disappear into darkness. Soon, these ancient stones will surround people resting through one more frozen winter night. And the story of how they slept is only beginning. The evening continues its slow journey toward darkness, and you begin to notice how the monastery changes as the final hours of activity disappear. The sounds that filled the building earlier become softer. The footsteps become fewer. Conversations fade into whispers. The great stone structure seems to settle into itself, preparing for the long winter night ahead. You follow the monks as they complete their final tasks before sleep. There is no sudden moment when everyone simply stops working. Rest is something carefully reached through a series of small actions. A medieval night begins with preparation. The corridors are colder now. The warmth from daytime activity has faded, leaving only small pockets of comfort near fires and occupied rooms. You pull your imaginary cloak closer and feel how important clothing becomes in this world. A simple layer of wool is not a fashion choice, it is protection. The monks understand this better than anyone. Their clothing must serve many purposes. It must allow movement during work, provide warmth during prayer, and offer comfort during sleep. Every piece of fabric has value because replacing it is not easy. As you walk toward the area where the monks gather for evening prayers, you hear the gentle movement of robes against stone floors. The sound is quiet and rhythmic. Candle flames flicker nearby, creating moving shadows along the walls. The evening prayer service marks an important transition. The working day is ending. The sleeping hours are approaching. The monks are preparing not only their bodies but their thoughts. Medieval monastic life was heavily shaped by religious schedules, and prayer services organized the day from morning until night. These routines help create stability in a world where weather, illness, and uncertainty were constant companions. You might find it strange that a community preparing for sleep would spend part of that time focused on staying awake and gathering together. But for the monks, nighttime was not simply a period of rest, it was also a spiritual time. The darkness outside had a different meaning in the medieval world without electric lights. Night arrived with much greater force. The countryside became almost completely black after sunset. The stars appeared brighter. The sounds of animals and weather became more noticeable. Inside the monastery, candles became precious sources of light. Their flames were small compared with modern lamps, and they required attention. A candle could illuminate a page, a face, or a small area of a room, but it could not transform the entire building. You watch as the final prayers conclude. The monks slowly leave the gathering space and begin moving toward their sleeping area. There is a calmness in their movements. They are following a routine repeated many times before. The journey towards sleep is not rushed. It is deliberate. Historians still debate how much individual freedom monks had within these strict routines, because written monastic rules often describe expectations rather than every ordinary experience. Some communities may have followed schedules more flexibly than official texts suggest. You enter the sleeping hall and immediately feel a different atmosphere. The room is larger than you expected. The ceiling disappears into darkness above you. Along the walls are simple sleeping spaces arranged for the community. The smell of wool, wood, and old stone fills the air. It is not unpleasant. It is simply the natural scent of a place where many people live together through the seasons. There is a practical reason for the shared sleeping arrangement. A large dormitory allows easier supervision and reflects the communal values of monastic life. It also means warmth from many people remains within one space, rather than being divided among many smaller rooms. A curious medieval detail is that some communities use curtains or simple barriers around sleeping spaces to create a small sense of privacy. These were not modern bedrooms, but they show that even people living collectively valued moments of personal separation. You notice monks arranging their bedding carefully. A blanket placed incorrectly could mean a colder night. A garment left too far away could become uncomfortable to retrieve when the room was freezing. Small decisions matter here very much. The sleeping area contains no unnecessary decoration. The focus is function. The monks need a place to rest so they can continue their responsibilities tomorrow. Their beds are part of a larger cycle of work, prayer, and recovery. You might wonder whether people in the Middle Ages slept exactly as we do today. The answer is complicated. Human bodies still required rest, but sleeping habits were influenced by environment, culture, and daily routines. Some historians suggest medieval people often experienced interrupted sleep patterns, waking during the night before returning to rest. Historians still argue whether this pattern was common everywhere or mainly influenced by certain communities and periods. The monastery becomes quieter. One by one, the monks settle into their places. The sounds of movement slowly disappear. The last candles continue burning, creating small islands of golden light against the darkness. Outside, the frozen wind continues its journey across the fields. It touches the walls, searches for openings, and reminds everyone that winter remains close. But inside, the monastery has prepared. The people here are not defeating the cold, they are living alongside it. Their routines, their clothing, their architecture, and their community all work together to create a fragile but meaningful comfort. You stand quietly at the entrance of the sleeping hall and watch the final moments before rest arrives, 1,000 years later. The details may seem unfamiliar, but the feeling is not. A long day ending, a cold night beginning, a place of shelter, a moment of peace. The monks close their eyes beneath the ancient stone roof, and the frozen night continues outside. You remain quietly inside the sleeping hall as the monastery finally reaches the hour of rest. The last movements have faded, and the large room now holds only the gentle sounds of breathing, shifting blankets, and the occasional creak of old wooden furniture. Outside, winter continues its slow work against the stone walls, but inside this shared space, the monks settle into a fragile comfort created through preparation and habit. The sleeping hall is unlike any bedroom you know today. There are no private rooms with personal decorations, no shelves filled with belongings, and no soft mattresses designed for complete relaxation. Instead, the space reflects the values of medieval monastic life. Simplicity, discipline, and community shape every corner. You look across the room and see rows of sleeping places arranged with practical purpose. Each monk has a small area where his bedding rests. The arrangement allows everyone to sleep together while still maintaining a sense of order. The air feels cool against your skin. The stone floor beneath you holds the chill of the night. Yet there is also a strange warmth created by human presence. Dozens of people sharing the same space changes the atmosphere. The room is not comfortable because it is luxurious. It is comfortable because it is alive. Medieval monasteries varied greatly in size and wealth. Some housed only a small group of monks, while others became major religious centres with hundreds of residents and workers. These sleeping arrangements depended on the resources, traditions, and location of each community. The monastery you're visiting tonight is part of a larger world where religious houses existed throughout Europe. These communities preserved books, cultivated land, cared for travellers, and provided places of learning. But behind these important roles were ordinary experiences, including the simple challenge of getting through a cold night. You notice the bedding more closely. The materials are practical and durable. Wool plays an important role because it provides warmth even when the air is damp. Wool clothing and blankets were valuable possessions because they protected people from conditions that could not be controlled. A monk preparing for sleep might adjust layers carefully, placing fabric where it provided the most warmth. The goal was not luxury. The goal was conserving body heat through the night. This required awareness. Every night, the monks understood their environment because they had no choice. Modern people can often ignore the outside temperature while staying inside climate-controlled buildings. Medieval people remained connected to the natural world around them. If winter became colder, everyone noticed. If supplies became limited, everyone adjusted. If storms blocked roads, the entire community felt the effects. You hear a small movement nearby. Someone turns beneath a blanket. Another person quietly adjusts their position. The shared sleeping hall creates a different relationship with nighttime. Sleep is private in one sense, but also collective. A curious detail from medieval sleeping customs is that some people preferred sleeping with their upper body slightly raised, believing certain positions were healthier. These beliefs came from medieval ideas about the body and balance, many of which differed from modern medical understanding. You watch the monks settle into stillness and wonder what thoughts move through their minds. Are they thinking about tomorrow's work? Are they reflecting on their prayers? Are they simply hoping for a warmer night? Probably all of these things. People from the past were not completely different from people today. They had worries, hopes, habits, and moments of quiet reflection. The difference was that their daily challenges were often more closely connected to the physical world. A frozen night was not just uncomfortable, it could change everything. The sleeping hall itself reveals this reality. Its design shows both the strengths and limitations of medieval life. A shared room helped create community and conserve warmth, but it also meant people had less personal space. Historians still argue whether monks experienced sleeping arrangements as restrictive or comforting, because medieval writings often focus more on spiritual ideas than personal feelings. A rule describing shared sleeping does not always tell us how individuals emotionally experienced it. You notice the small details that reveal human adaptation. A cloak placed nearby for morning, a pair of shoes positioned where they can be found quickly, a blanket folded carefully because the night air will become colder before sunrise. These tiny actions would seem ordinary to the monks, but centuries later they reveal something important. People have always searched for comfort. The methods change. The need remains. The monastery becomes almost completely silent now. The candles have been reduced to faint points of light. Shadows stretch across the walls. The wind outside creates a low sound that rises and falls like a distant voice. You imagine lying among the monks, feeling the weight of the blanket above you. The fabric is heavy, but reassuring. The cold still exists, but it feels farther away. This is the strange balance of medieval winter life. Comfort and discomfort exist together. You're never completely warm. You are never completely alone. The night continues. The monks sleep because tomorrow requires their energy. Morning will bring prayer, work, and another cycle of responsibilities. But for now, the monastery rests. The sleeping hall becomes a small world separated from the frozen landscape outside. Within these stone walls, people breathe, dream, and wait for the first light of dawn. The winter storm may continue. The wind may grow stronger. But beneath layers of wool and beneath the shelter of ancient architecture, the monks of 1268 find a few precious hours of rest. The night deepens around the monastery, and you remain inside the sleeping hall where the monks are slowly surrendering themselves to rest. The first sharp cold of evening has become a steady presence, no longer surprising but impossible to ignore. The stone walls hold their winter memory. The wooden beams above you creak softly, and the air carries the quiet scent of wool, smoke, and old timber. You look across the room and notice something important about medieval survival. Warmth does not come from one great source. There is no single invention that transforms this frozen space into a comfortable refuge. Instead, warmth comes from many small protections working together: a layer of clothing, a thick blanket, a nearby body, a carefully maintained fire, a sheltered building. Each one has a little comfort. Together, they make the night possible. The monks have learned that surviving winter requires preparation long before the sun disappears. The clothing they wear during the day must continue serving them after work ends. Medieval garments were often designed for endurance because people did not have large collections of seasonal clothing waiting in storage. Wool is especially important in this world. It provides insulation and remains useful even in damp conditions. For medieval communities, sheep were not simply animals providing food, they were also sources of essential material for staying alive. You touch the edge of a wool blanket and imagine its rough texture. It is not the smooth fabric found in modern homes. It is heavier, more practical, and created for protection rather than decoration. The blanket does not remove the cold. It negotiates with it. This is how medieval people often approached nature. They did not expect complete control over their environment. They learned how to adapt, compromise, and endure. The sleeping monks use several methods to preserve warmth. Some keep their clothing nearby so they can quickly dress when waking during the night. Others arrange blankets carefully to prevent heat from escaping. Small habits become valuable because there are no easy solutions. A curious detail from medieval life is that people sometimes shared sleeping spaces beyond religious communities as a practical response to cold conditions. Travelers, family members, and workers could sleep close together because shared warmth had real value. You listen carefully and hear the rhythm of the room. Breathing rises and falls. A few people shift in their sleep. Somewhere outside, the wind pushes against the monastery walls. The cold is still there, but the monks are prepared. Historians know that medieval Europeans used various forms of bedding, including materials such as straw, wool, and fabric coverings. However, historians still debate how common certain bedding practices were among different social groups, because surviving evidence usually represents wealthier communities more clearly than ordinary households. You notice that the monastery itself plays a major role in this struggle against winter. The walls may be cold, but they block the strongest winds. The roof keeps snow and rain away. The shared spaces allow resources to be concentrated. A person alone in a small building would face a very different night. Community is the hidden warmth of the monastery. Every person inside depends on others. Someone prepared the food, someone collected fuel, someone repaired damaged areas, someone cleaned the sleeping space. The final comfort of the night comes from many hours of unseen effort. This is something easy to forget when looking at history from a distance. Objects do not simply appear. Every blanket, candle, and piece of furniture represents work. You move your attention toward the darker corners of the room. The shadows seem deeper now. The candlelight has almost disappeared. Without modern lighting, nighttime would have felt much larger and more powerful. The darkness itself shaped how people experienced sleep. The hours after sunset were not simply extra time for entertainment. They were periods of limited activity. Many people naturally rested earlier because light was expensive and difficult to maintain. The monastery followed this pattern while adding its own religious meaning. Night could be a time for reflection, prayer, and quiet discipline. You imagine one monk lying awake for a few moments, listening to the storm outside. Perhaps he thinks about the coming morning. Perhaps he remembers a conversation from the day. Perhaps he simply feels the warmth beneath his blanket and appreciates this small comfort. Even in a disciplined environment, people remained human. They felt tired. They felt cold. They searched for peace. The winter night continues passing slowly. The monks are not fighting against sleep. They welcome it because rest is necessary for another demanding day. Outside, the frozen fields remain silent. The trees stand motionless. The roads become harder beneath the frost. The monastery appears like a small island of human life surrounded by winter. Inside, the blankets create a barrier between body and cold. They are simple objects, but they represent centuries of knowledge. Generations before these monks discovered how to survive difficult nights through careful choices. A blanket is not just fabric, it is memory. It carries the lessons of previous winters. As you remain in the sleeping hall, you begin to understand that medieval sleep was never only about closing your eyes. It was about creating enough safety to allow the body to rest. The monks do not have perfect conditions. They have enough, and sometimes enough is what allows people to continue. The monastery grows quieter. The wind becomes softer in the distance. The darkness surrounds the stone walls, but inside the sleeping hall, warmth remains. The frozen night continues. The monks sleep, and slowly, beneath layers of wool and centuries of tradition, the monastery settles into peace. The monastery has now entered the deepest part of the night, when the outside world feels distant and the smallest sounds become impossible to ignore. You remain inside the sleeping hall, surrounded by the monks who have slowly disappeared into dreams. The fire has weakened in nearby rooms. The candles have grown shorter, and the ancient building listens quietly to the winter storm. At first, the silence feels complete. Then you begin noticing the hidden sounds of the night. A wooden beam shifts above you as the temperature changes. A small gust of air moves through a narrow opening. Someone quietly turns beneath a blanket. The monastery is not silent at all. It is simply speaking softly. You feel the atmosphere of this place changing after sunset. During the day, the monastery was filled with movement and purpose. People carried supplies, prepared meals, copied texts, and completed their responsibilities. Now, the building belongs to shadows, gentle breathing, and the slow passing of time. For people living in the 13th century, nighttime had a very different character. Without modern lighting, darkness arrived quickly and completely. The world outside the monastery became harder to see, making sounds and smells much more noticeable. You imagine stepping outside for a moment. The cold air touches your face immediately. The frozen ground feels hard beneath your feet. The wind moves across the fields without interruption, carrying the scent of the snow, trees, and distant earth. Then you return inside. The difference is dramatic. The monastery does not feel warm by modern standards, but it feels protected. The walls block the strongest winds. The roof creates shelter. The presence of other people creates reassurance. This feeling of security was one of the greatest advantages of communal living during medieval winters. A monastery was not only a religious centre, it was also a carefully managed community where people depended on shared resources. Food storage, clothing production, repairs, and heating all required cooperation. The night reveals this cooperation in quiet ways. A monk sleeping peacefully is benefiting from countless actions completed before darkness arrived. Someone gathered fuel, someone prepared bedding, someone maintained the buildings. History often remembers the famous figures of the Middle Ages, but ordinary routines reveal just as much about the past. You notice the smell of the sleeping hall again. Wool blankets have a natural earthy scent. Wooden furniture carries the smell of age. The faint remains of smoke from fireplaces linger in the air. These details create a world that feels distant, yet strangely familiar. Everyone has experienced the moment before sleep when the day finally becomes quiet. The difference is that these monks reached that moment in a world where comfort required more effort. A small sound breaks the stillness. Perhaps a monk wakes briefly. Perhaps he adjusts his blanket or checks the position of his clothing. Then the room returns to calm. Medieval sleep was not always a perfect, uninterrupted experience. People could wake because of cold, noise, physical discomfort, or scheduled religious practices. The idea of sleeping through the entire night was not universal. Historians still argue whether interrupted sleep was a normal pattern for most medieval people, or whether it depended heavily on social class, occupation, and location. Written records provide clues, but they do not capture every personal experience. You look around the sleeping hall and imagine how strange this arrangement would feel today. Dozens of people resting in one large room might seem unusual, but for many medieval communities, shared spaces were normal. The monks were connected even while sleeping. They could hear when someone moved. They knew others were nearby. In a world where winter illness and difficult conditions were common, being surrounded by a community provided a sense of safety. A curious detail from medieval sleeping habits is that some people believe certain dreams carried spiritual meaning or messages. Dreams were often viewed through religious and symbolic ideas rather than purely personal interpretation. For monks especially, nighttime thoughts could become connected with reflection and devotion. Sleep was not only a physical process, it existed alongside their spiritual understanding of the world. The storm outside continues. The wind brushes against the monastery walls like waves against a ship. Snow and frost cover the landscape beyond the windows. The fields, roads, and forests are temporarily transformed into a quiet, frozen world. Inside, the sleeping hall remains steady. The monks have created a small environment where life can continue despite the season. Their solution is not impressive in the way modern technology is impressive. There are no machines, no advanced systems, and no instant comfort. There is only knowledge. Knowledge of clothing, knowledge of buildings, knowledge of season, knowledge of survival. You begin to appreciate how much wisdom existed in these simple practices. The monks did not have control over winter, but they understood how to respond to it. The night moves slowly. Hours pass without urgency. The monastery remains wrapped in darkness, holding its community together through another frozen evening. Somewhere beyond the walls, the wind continues its endless journey across the land. But inside, there is breathing, there is shelter, there is rest. The sleeping monks remain beneath their blankets, trusting the structure around them and the traditions that have guided their lives. The monastery sleeps with them. The frozen night continues to unfold, and you remain within the monastery where darkness has settled over every corridor and chamber. The sleeping hall has become a world of its own, separated from the storm outside by thick walls, wooden doors, and centuries of careful construction, yet even in this protected place, the monks do not simply fall asleep without thought. Sleep begins with preparation. You notice how the final moments before rest are filled with quiet personal habits. One monk adjusts his blanket, another places his clothing nearby for the morning. Someone checks that a small belonging is safely stored. These actions are simple, but they reveal how much attention medieval people gave to ordinary routines. The modern world often treats bedtime as a quick transition between activity and rest. For the monks of 1268, sleep was part of a larger rhythm. The way they prepared for the night reflected their beliefs, responsibilities, and understanding of discipline. The monastery teaches patience. Everything happens, and slowly. The candles burn lower, the voices disappear, the footsteps become rare. The room gradually transforms from a place of movement into a place of waiting. You feel the cold air resting against your face, and the blanket around you provides some warmth, but the temperature remains noticeable. This is not a room where winter can be forgotten. The season is present in every breath. The monks have learned to accept this presence. They do not see the cold as an unusual disaster every night. Winter is simply part of their world. A medieval person grew up understanding seasonal changes in a way that many people today rarely experience. The arrival of winter affected farming, travel, food, clothing, and daily schedules. The cold was not a temporary inconvenience. It was a force that shaped life, before sleeping. Many monks followed spiritual practices that helped them prepare mentally for the night. Prayer, reflection, and silence created a sense of calm before rest. The goal was not entertainment or distraction. The goal was inner peace. You listen to the quiet around you and imagine the thoughts passing through their minds. Perhaps one monk remembers a lesson from the day, perhaps another thinks about tomorrow's work, perhaps someone simply listens to the wind and waits for sleep to arrive. Even in a strict environment, personal experiences were different. A curious detail from medieval monastic life is that some communities placed importance on controlling speech and unnecessary conversation during certain periods. Silence was not only practical, it was considered a valuable discipline that encouraged reflection. The sleeping hall benefits from this tradition. There are no loud conversations, no bright lights, no distractions. The environment naturally encourages rest. Historians still debate how closely everyday monastic behaviour matched official religious rules, because written instructions often describe the ideal lifestyle rather than every ordinary moment. Real communities likely adapted their routines based on circumstances. You move your attention toward the entrance of the dormitory. The wooden door stands between the sleeping monks and the colder passage beyond. It is not a perfect barrier, but it represents an important idea, a boundary. Inside is the community. Outside is the winter. This simple division carries emotional weight. People have always created spaces where they feel protected. The monastery is one of those spaces. The sound of the wind becomes stronger for a moment. It moves around the building and creates a low, continuous sound. The monks barely react. They have heard winter storms before. The building has heard them too. The stones have endured many seasons. They have experienced countless nights of rain, frost, and snow. Every winter leaves its mark, but the monastery continues standing. You might wonder about the people who built and maintained such places. The monks sleeping here are not the only ones connected to this story. Builders, farmers, craftsmen, cooks, and workers all contributed to the survival of the community. A monastery was a shared achievement. The warmth of the sleeping hall exists because many people prepared the conditions for rest. You notice a faint smell of herbs somewhere nearby. Medieval communities sometimes used plants for practical purposes, including cleaning, cooking, and personal care. The scents around a monastery could come from gardens, stored materials, and daily activities. The world outside may feel frozen, but inside there are reminders of life continuing. Food stores remain protected. Tools remain ready. Books remain preserved. People continue resting. The night is not empty. It is simply quiet. You imagine lying down among the monks and feeling the heavy blanket settle over you. The rough fabric touches your hands. The air remains cool. The stone walls surround the room. There is comfort in knowing that others are nearby. The monks are part of something larger than themselves. Their sleeping arrangement reflects a belief that life is shared. Even during the most private moments of rest, they remain connected to the community. This idea feels very different from modern expectations of personal space. Today, many people see a bedroom as a private retreat. In the monastery, the sleeping hall represents belonging. The winter night continues passing. The storm outside does not disappear. The cold does not surrender. But inside the monastery, people have created enough peace to sleep. The final candles fade. The wooden beams settle. The monks breathe quietly beneath their blankets. And as the frozen world waits outside the stone walls, the monastery enters another long winter dream. The winter night has reached its coldest hours. When darkness feels deepest and the frozen air outside seems to press hardest against the monastery walls, you remain inside the sleeping hall, where the monks lie quietly beneath their blankets, protected by layers of preparation but never completely separated from the presence of winter. The cold is always nearby. You can feel it in the room. The stone walls release their stored chill. The floor remains hard beneath your feet. The air touches your face with a sharp freshness that reminds you this is a world without modern heating. Yet the monks are not surprised by this discomfort. They have spent their entire lives learning how to live with conditions that cannot be changed. Winter is not an enemy that can be defeated. It is a season that must be understood. You look around the sleeping hall and notice how every object has a purpose. The blankets are not decorative. The clothing is not chosen for appearance. The wooden structures are not built for luxury. Everything exists because it helps people continue through difficult conditions. This practical mindset shaped medieval life. People saved what they could. They repaired what they owned. They used resources carefully. A simple item could have enormous importance. A wool blanket represented labour from many stages of production. Someone cared for sheep. Someone collected wool. Someone cleaned and prepared the fibres. Someone created the fabric. By the time it reached a sleeping monk, it carried the work of many hands. You begin to understand that warmth was never created instantly. It was built slowly through effort and cooperation. The monks sleeping around you are surrounded by the results of that effort. Their bodies create some warmth within the shared room. Their clothing provides insulation. The monastery architecture reduces exposure to the worst weather. Each element supports the others. Medieval people often relied on this combination of small advantages. There was rarely one perfect solution to a problem. Survival came from combining many imperfect solutions until they became enough. A curious detail from medieval winter life is that people sometimes used natural materials such as straw or dried plants in bedding, because these materials could provide additional insulation. These methods were practical responses to the environment, especially in communities where resources had to be managed carefully. You imagine the monks adjusting their sleeping arrangements throughout the night. Perhaps someone folds a blanket differently. Perhaps another moves closer to the centre of the room where the air feels slightly less cold. Small movements, small choices, small comforts. The battle against winter happens quietly. Historians still argue how comfortable monastic sleeping conditions were compared with those of ordinary villagers because surviving descriptions often come from religious texts that focus more on discipline than physical experience. The reality likely changed greatly depending on the monastery, region, and available resources. You return your attention to the walls around you. They appear permanent and powerful, but they also reveal the limitations of medieval construction. A thick stone building can protect against wind and weather, but it cannot completely transform cold air into warmth. This truth creates a fascinating contrast. The monastery is impressive. The monastery is vulnerable. Both things are true. The monks live inside one of the strongest structures available to them. Yet they still depend on simple human solutions. They still need blankets. They still need firewood. They still need cooperation. Outside, the winter storm continues its quiet movement across the landscape. The wind passes over empty fields and frozen paths. Snow gathers in places where footsteps travelled earlier in the day. Inside, the sleeping hall remains calm. The difference between the outside world and this room is not the absence of cold. The difference is preparation. The monks have created a place where the cold can be endured. This idea appears throughout human history. People have always built shelters that reflect their environment. In deserts, people designed homes to escape heat. In colder regions, people created spaces that protected against wind and preserved warmth. The monastery belongs to this long human tradition. You hear the faint sound of wood moving somewhere deeper in the building. Perhaps a caretaker is checking supplies. Perhaps someone is maintaining the last remaining fire. Even during the quietest hours, certain tasks continue. A community cannot completely sleep. Someone is always watching. Someone is always preparing. This hidden labour is easy to overlook when imagining the past. We often picture historical figures resting peacefully, but behind every peaceful moment there were people working to make that moment possible. The monks sleeping tonight are surrounded by invisible support. The people who repaired the roof, the people who prepared the food, the people who maintained the fires, the people who protected the supplies. All of them are part of this winter night. You feel the weight of history in this simple scene. There is no grand battle happening, no dramatic event is unfolding. There is only a group of people trying to rest while winter surrounds them, and perhaps that is what makes the moment meaningful. Ordinary nights reveal ordinary lives. Ordinary lives create history. The hours continue moving forward. The cold remains, the darkness remains, but the monastery remains as well. The monks breathe slowly beneath their blankets. The ancient stones surround them. The storm outside becomes only a distant sound. For a few peaceful hours, the struggle against winter pauses. The monks sleep. The monastery waits. And the frozen night continues. The monastery remains suspended in the quiet hours before dawn, and you continue observing the sleeping hall as the frozen night slowly moves forward. The monks rest beneath their blankets, but their peaceful sleep is connected to everything that happened before darkness arrived. The food prepared earlier, the clothing carefully maintained, and the shelter repaired throughout the year all come together in this single moment of rest. You begin to understand that sleep in the medieval world was never separate from daily life. A person did not simply finish the day and enter a comfortable room. Rest depended on countless preparations made by the entire community. The sleeping monks are surrounded by evidence of this preparation. The smell of wool remains in the air. The scent of old wood fills the room. A faint trace of smoke travels from the distant fireplaces through the monastery passages. These smells are ordinary, but they tell the story of survival. You look toward the entrance of the sleeping hall and imagine the monks earlier in the evening, returning from their final tasks before they rested. Many would have shared a simple meal that helped prepare their bodies for the cold hours ahead. Food was one of the monastery's greatest defences against winter. A warm meal could provide energy. A stored supply could provide security. A shared table could strengthen community. Medieval monasteries often managed large agricultural resources, including gardens, fields, and livestock. These resources allowed communities to preserve food for seasons when fresh supplies became difficult to obtain. Winter changed eating habits. Fresh fruits and vegetables became less available in many regions. Stored grains, dried foods, preserved vegetables, and other supplies became especially important. You imagine the monastery kitchen after sunset. The fire lowered, but the room still carries memories of activity. Wooden tables remain covered with traces of preparation. Clay containers hold stored ingredients. The smell of cooked food lingers gently in the air. The kitchen is not only a place where meals are made, it is a place where survival is organised. A curious detail from medieval food history is that monasteries sometimes produced their own drinks and preserved foods as part of their self-sufficient systems. These practices helped communities remain stable when outside travel became difficult during harsh weather. You return to the sleeping hall and realize that the comfort of the night began many hours earlier in those kitchen and storage rooms. A monk sleeping peacefully is connected to farmers who worked the land. He is connected to workers who cared for animals. He is connected to people who prepared supplies. Everything is connected. Historians still debate how much variety existed in monastic diets, because records often describe ideal arrangements or special occasions rather than every ordinary meal. Daily food likely changed depending on region, wealth, and seasonal conditions. You think about how different winter must have felt when every meal carried greater importance. Today, many people can easily access food regardless of season. In 1268, the arrival of winter could completely change what was available. A poor harvest could create hardship. A successful harvest could provide security. Preparation mattered. The monks understood this relationship with the seasons. Their entire lifestyle was built around cycles of abundance and scarcity. The winter night outside becomes a reminder of those cycles. The frozen fields are not producing crops now. The land is resting. The community depends on what was collected and stored before the cold arrived. You imagine a monk waking briefly during the night. Perhaps he feels the cold air and pulls the blanket closer. Perhaps he remembers the warm meal from the evening before. Perhaps that simple memory provides comfort. The human connection between food and safety is timeless. A warm meal tells the body that it is cared for. A shared meal tells the mind that it belongs. The monastery provided both. You notice how the sleeping hall feels different now compared with earlier. At the beginning of the evening, the room was a place of preparation. Now it has become a place of restoration. The same space serves two purposes depending on the hour. This flexibility was common in medieval life. Buildings had to serve practical needs because resources were limited. Rooms could have multiple functions, and people adapted spaces according to circumstances. A curious feature of medieval communities was the importance of seasonal planning. People did not simply react to winter when it arrived. They spent months preparing for it through farming, storage, repairs, and collecting materials. Winter survival began long before the first snow. You look around the monastery again and see the results of that preparation everywhere. The walls, the blankets, the stored food, the quiet routines. All of these represent decisions made months earlier. The monks continue sleeping as the night slowly approaches its final hours. Outside, the storm has softened. The wind no longer sounds as powerful as before, but the cold remains. The monastery does not need winter to disappear. It only needs to endure until morning. This simple truth shaped countless lives throughout history. People often survive difficult conditions not through dramatic moments of bravery, but through ordinary habits repeated every day. A person storing grain, a person repairing clothing, a person carrying firewood, a person preparing a bed. These actions may seem small, but together they created survival. You remain in the sleeping hall and listen to the peaceful sounds around you. The monks continue resting because generations of knowledge have prepared this moment. The night is still cold. The walls are still stone. The blankets are still simple, but the community is ready. And as the monastery waits for the first light of morning, the frozen night slowly begins to release its grip. The frozen night continues above the monastery, but inside the stone walls, another story is unfolding quietly. You begin to notice the people who are often forgotten when imagining medieval life. The monks may be the most visible residents of the monastery, but they are not the only ones who keep this world alive. Behind every peaceful night of sleep, there are many unseen hands. Someone prepares the rooms. Someone carries supplies. Someone repairs what winter damages. Someone makes sure the community can continue. You walk through the darker passages beyond the sleeping hall and imagine the activity that existed here before everyone rested. The monastery does not function by itself. It depends on a network of people working together, each person contributing something necessary. The workers connected to a medieval monastery could include cooks, farmers, craftsmen, servants, and labourers. Their responsibilities were different from those of the monks, but their efforts were essential. Without them, the religious community could not maintain its daily routines. The cold winter night makes this even clearer. A fire does not appear by itself. Food does not prepare itself. Buildings do not repair themselves. Every comfort has a history. You notice the smell of stored wood near a service area. The scent is dry and earthy, mixed with the cold air flowing through the passage. A pile of firewood represents hours of work completed before the snow arrived. Someone had to gather it. Someone had to cut it. Someone had to organize it. The warmth enjoyed by people sleeping inside the monastery began with labor outside in the fields and forests. This connection between effort and comfort was much more visible in medieval life. Modern people often receive warmth, food, and shelter without seeing the process behind them. In 1268, the process was impossible to ignore. Every person understood that survival required cooperation. You imagine a worker returning through the monastery courtyard earlier in the evening. His hands are cold from carrying supplies. His clothing carries the smell of smoke and outdoor air. He has completed a task that may never be recorded in a history book, yet it helped create the peaceful night you are witnessing. Ordinary people created extraordinary endurance. Medieval monasteries were often major landowners, and many relied on agricultural communities connected to their estates. Farmers worked the land, cared for animals, and produced resources that supported the monastery throughout the year. Winter was the season when those preparations became visible. Stored grain filled the rooms. Preserved foods protected against shortages. Maintained buildings protected people from storms. The entire community was connected to the changing seasons. Historians still argue about the exact relationship between monks and the workers around them, because medieval records often focus on religious leaders and institutions rather than the daily experiences of ordinary labourers. Much of their work must be reconstructed from scattered evidence. You move quietly through the imagined service areas of the monastery and picture the objects left behind after the day ends. Wooden containers, simple tools, baskets used for carrying supplies. These objects seem ordinary, but they reveal a world built through constant effort. A curious detail from medieval monasteries is that some communities developed highly specialized skills among their members and workers. Certain people became known for particular crafts, farming methods, or forms of production that supported the monastery's independence. The monastery was not only a place of prayer, it was also a place of organization. You return mentally to the sleeping hall, where the monks continue resting. Their peaceful sleep depends on all these hidden activities. The blanket covering one person represents someone who helped create or maintain it. The meal remembered from earlier represents someone who prepared it. The night reveals an important truth about history. Even people who appear separated from society are connected to countless others. The monks may spend much of their time in silence, but their lives depend on a larger community surrounding them. You hear the imagined sounds of the monastery after midnight. A distant footstep, a door opening briefly, a quiet movement from someone completing a necessary task. The building never becomes completely still. There is always some small activity continuing. A monastery during winter is not a frozen monument. It is a living place. You begin to understand why studying everyday life can be just as fascinating as studying famous events. The story of one cold night tells us about architecture, agriculture, social relationships, and human adaptation. It tells us about people who rarely appear in grand historical stories. The person carrying wood, the person preparing food, the person repairing clothing, the person maintaining shelter. Their work created the conditions for rest. Outside, the winter landscape remains silent. The fields are frozen, the roads are empty, the sky is dark and endless. Inside, the monastery remains protected, not because winter becomes gentle, not because the building is perfect, but because many people have worked together to make survival possible. You return once more to the sleeping hall and watch the monks resting beneath their blankets. The room feels different now. You no longer see only sleeping figures. You see the entire network of effort surrounding them. A quiet night of sleep is the final result of a much larger story. The monastery breathes. The community rests. The winter continues. And somewhere beyond the stone walls, the people who helped create this moment also wait for morning. The monastery remains wrapped in darkness, and you continue watching the sleeping hall as the frozen hours slowly pass. The monks rest quietly, but the night reveals something fascinating about medieval sleep. Resting in the 13th century was not exactly the same experience as sleep today. The habits, beliefs, and rhythms surrounding sleep were shaped by a world very different from your own. You look across the room and notice that sleep here feels almost like another daily activity with its own traditions. The monks do not simply close their eyes and disappear into the night. Their sleeping habits reflect their environment, their faith, and the practical challenges of living through winter. The first thing you notice is the shared nature of the space. Everyone sleeps together in the same hall. This arrangement might feel unusual now, but it was common in many medieval communities. Privacy was not always considered essential in the way it is today. Instead, connection mattered. Safety mattered. Community mattered. The sleeping hall provided all three. You hear the soft sounds of breathing around you. The room has a steady rhythm. Each person rests individually, but everyone is part of the same quiet environment. The cold makes this arrangement especially meaningful. A single person facing a freezing night alone would experience the darkness differently. Surrounded by others, the winter feels less overwhelming. The monks have created comfort through togetherness. Medieval people also had different ideas about the ideal sleeping environment. Darkness, quiet, and stillness were valued. But sleep was also connected with spiritual thoughts and beliefs about the body. Some medieval writings discussed health through ideas that modern science no longer accepts, including beliefs about bodily balance and natural qualities. These concepts influenced how people thought about daily habits, including eating, working, and sleeping. A curious detail from medieval life is that people sometimes associated certain dreams with deeper meanings, believing they could reflect spiritual concerns or important messages. Dreams were not always viewed as random experiences. They could be interpreted through religious and cultural traditions. You imagine a monk waking briefly during the night and remembering a dream in the quiet darkness. That dream might feel significant. Without modern distractions, nighttime thoughts could become much more powerful. The monastery encourages this kind of reflection. There are no bright screens, no sudden noises from distant cities, no endless streams of information, only darkness, silence, and the mind. You begin to understand why nighttime could feel almost sacred in medieval communities. The hours after sunset created a different relationship with time. The darkness encouraged slower thoughts and deeper attention. Historians still argue whether medieval people generally slept in one long period or experienced a more interrupted pattern, because evidence from personal experiences is limited. Some researchers suggest nighttime waking was common, while others believe sleeping habits varied widely. The monks in this monastery may wake for prayer, discomfort, or natural reasons. Their night is not a perfect, uninterrupted journey. It is a series of moments connected by rest. You notice how the sleeping hall allows this flexibility. People can wake quietly, move carefully, and return to rest without leaving the community. The building itself supports the rhythm of life. A small movement occurs nearby. Someone shifts beneath a blanket. The sound disappears almost immediately. The room returns to peace. There is something deeply human about these small moments. A person from 1268 and a person today share the same basic experience of trying to become comfortable before sleep. The methods are different. The desire is the same. You want warmth. You want safety. You want safety. You want peace. The monks simply pursue these things with fewer resources. The winter air continues moving through the monastery. You feel the cold against the exposed skin and imagine how carefully people must have managed their belongings. Losing a blanket or damaging clothing could create serious discomfort. Everything had value. Everything required care. This careful relationship with possessions shaped medieval habits. People repaired objects because replacement was difficult. They maintained clothing because materials required significant effort to produce. A worn blanket was not immediately discarded. A damaged garment was repaired. A useful object remained useful for as long as possible. The sleeping hall reflects this philosophy. It is not filled with excess. It contains what people need. You notice how peaceful this simplicity feels. The room does not demand attention. There are no decorations competing with the quiet atmosphere. The focus is on rest itself. The monks have created a small island of calm within a difficult environment. Outside, the frozen night continues. The wind moves across the landscape. The trees remain still. The monastery stands against the darkness. Inside, people sleep according to the traditions developed over generations. Their habits may seem strange today, but they reveal something familiar. Human beings have always searched for ways to rest. They have always created rituals around the end of the day. They have always looked for comfort when the world becomes quiet. You remain in the sleeping hall as the hours continue. The monks are no longer simply historical figures from a distant century. They become ordinary people experiencing an ordinary night. They are tired. They are cold, they are resting, and for a brief moment, separated by hundreds of years, you share the same quiet feeling, the desire for a peaceful night. The monastery remains still as the deepest hours of night slowly pass, and you begin to notice another important part of medieval sleep. Rest was never completely separate from time, even while people slept. The rhythms of prayer, duty, and tradition continued around them. You remain inside the sleeping hall, where the monks lie beneath their blankets. The room is dark except for the faintest traces of dying candlelight from nearby areas. The air is cool, the stone walls are quiet, yet somewhere beyond the dormitory, time continues to move. In a medieval monastery, time was not measured by glowing numbers or silent devices beside a bed. Instead, people followed natural signs and organized routines. The position of the sun, the changing seasons, and the sound of bells guided daily life. The bell was one of the most important sounds in the monastery. You imagine its deep tone travelling through the cold night air. It moves along corridors, across courtyards, and through the sleeping quarters. The sound does not feel like an interruption. It feels like part of the monastery itself. The monks lived according to a structured schedule of prayer known as the hours. Certain moments of the day and night were marked by gatherings and religious observances. This meant that sleep could exist alongside periods of wakefulness. A person resting in this monastery was never completely disconnected from the community. The bell could call. The monks could rise. The night could continue. You might find this surprising. In the modern world, waking during the night often feels like an unwanted disruption. Here, waking could have meaning. It was part of a larger pattern that connected daily life with spiritual purpose. The darkness outside made these nighttime moments especially powerful. Without modern lighting, the world after sunset felt enormous. A person walking through a dark monastery with only candlelight would experience the building differently. Every shadow mattered. Every sound carried. Every movement felt deliberate. You imagine a monk leaving the sleeping hall when the bell sounds. His feet touch the cold floor. His clothing is gathered quickly. The air feels sharp against his face. He moves through the dark corridor toward prayer. The journey itself becomes part of the experience. The cold reminds him that he's awake. The silence reminds him where he is. The candlelight guides him forward. A curious detail from medieval monasteries is that bells were not only practical tools for organizing schedules, they also became symbols of community because their sounds connected people across the entire monastery and surrounding area. The bell announced moments that everyone understood: morning, evening, prayer time, special occasions, the passage of time itself. You return to the sleeping hall after imagining this quiet movement through the building. The monks who remain resting continue their sleep, while others briefly participate in nighttime routines. The monastery adapts. It breathes. It continues. Historians still debate how consistently these nighttime practices were followed, because written schedules often represent official expectations rather than every real experience. Weather, illness, and local customs could influence how communities actually lived. A severe winter storm, for example, might change routines. A sick monk might need extra rest. A difficult journey or shortage of supplies could alter the usual schedule. Life was always more flexible than the rules written on parchment. You look around the sleeping hall and consider how strange it must have felt to live according to a completely different understanding of time. Today, many people organize their days around personal schedules. In the monastery, the individual was part of a larger rhythm. The community moved together. The community rested together. The community prayed together. This shared rhythm created stability. Winter made that stability even more important. During the coldest months, isolation could become dangerous. Staying connected through routines helped people maintain order. When the outside environment became harsh, you noticed the sounds around you again, the quiet breathing, the distant movement of someone walking, the soft creak of wood. The monastery never becomes completely silent because life continues even during sleep. This is one of the most fascinating parts of imagining a medieval night. The darkness does not represent emptiness, it represents another form of activity. People are resting. People are thinking. People are moving carefully through familiar spaces. The frozen world outside may appear motionless, but inside the monastery, human life continues. You think about how the monks might feel during these moments. Perhaps the nighttime prayers brought comfort. Perhaps the familiar routine created a sense of peace. Perhaps the repetition itself made the long winter nights easier to endure. Humans often find security in patterns. The same meal, the same path, the same sounds, the same traditions. The monastery provided these patterns every day. You look toward the sleeping monks and realize that their rest is shaped by more than blankets and walls. Their sleep is surrounded by a complete way of life. The bells, the prayers, the shared space, the winter season. Everything is connected. Outside, the frozen wind continues moving across the fields. Inside, the monastery follows its ancient rhythm. The night passes slowly, marked not by clocks but by traditions that have guided generations. The monks return to sleep. The candles continue fading. The stone walls remain silent, and the monastery waits patiently for morning. The frozen night reaches its most challenging moment as the storm outside grows stronger, and you remain inside the monastery listening to the world beyond the stone walls. The wind moves across the fields with increasing force, pushing against the ancient building and reminding everyone inside that winter is always nearby. You hear the storm before you see it. The sound travels through the monastery. A low whistle moves along the corridors. Wooden shutters shake gently. The roof responds with quiet creaks. The monks continue resting, but the weather has become the unseen presence sharing the night with them. A winter storm in the medieval world was not simply an inconvenience. It could affect travel, supplies, communication, and daily responsibilities. When roads became covered with snow or ice, communities often became more isolated. The monastery was designed to withstand these moments. Not perfectly, but enough. You look at the thick walls around you and understand why such structures mattered. They were not comfortable by modern standards, but they provided protection that smaller buildings could not always offer. The stone absorbs the strongest winds. The roof blocks falling snow. The enclosed spaces allow people to gather together. Every advantage matters during a storm. You imagine the landscape outside. The fields that were visible during the afternoon have disappeared beneath darkness and snow. The paths used by workers are now difficult to recognize. Trees stand motionless except when the wind pushes through their branches. The monastery has become separated from the outside world. Inside, however, life continues. This separation creates a strange feeling. The storm makes the monastery seem like a small island surrounded by a frozen sea. The monks are not fighting the weather directly. They are waiting safely within the shelter they prepared. You notice the importance of stored supplies during a night like this. Food, fuel, and materials gathered before winter allow the community to continue when outside movement becomes difficult. Preparation creates calm. Without preparation, storms create fear. A curious detail from medieval communities is that monasteries often served as places of shelter for travellers during difficult conditions. Their buildings and resources could provide protection when roads became dangerous and journeys had to stop. The monastery was not only home, it was also refuge. You imagine a traveller arriving at the gates on another winter night, covered in snow and exhausted from the journey. The same walls that surround the sleeping monks could offer protection to someone who had nowhere else to go. The storm outside makes the value of shelter very clear. A building is more than stone. It is security. Historians still debate how frequently medieval monasteries accepted travellers during severe winter conditions because practices differed between communities and regions. Some religious houses were known for hospitality, while others had stricter limits based on resources. You return your attention to the sleeping hall. The monks continue resting, but perhaps some are aware of the storm. Perhaps the sound of wind wakes them briefly. Perhaps they pull their blankets closer and listen before returning to sleep. The weather changes the atmosphere of the room. The monastery feels smaller, more protected, more connected. The storm creates a shared experience. Everyone inside knows what is happening outside. Everyone understands the importance of remaining together. You feel the contrast between the storm and the sleeping hall. Outside, cold, darkness, wind. Inside, breathing, shelter, rest. This contrast is what makes the medieval winter night so fascinating. The comfort of the monks does not come from eliminating the harsh world outside. It comes from creating a small place where life can continue despite that world. The monastery demonstrates a lesson repeated throughout human history. People survive difficult environments by adapting their surroundings and working together. They build stronger homes. They preserve resources. They create communities. They develop traditions. The storm continues through the night, but the monks have already done the most important work. They prepared before the storm arrived. You imagine the people who check the roof before winter, the workers who repaired damaged walls, the farmers who stored food, the individuals who collected firewood. Their efforts are invisible now, but they are present. Every warm moment inside the monastery contains the memory of preparation. A monk sleeping peacefully beneath a blanket is connected to months of planning. A quiet room is connected to years of building knowledge. A protected community is connected to generations of experience. The storm outside may seem powerful, but the monastery represents human patience. The wind rises again. The wooden beams answer with a soft movement. The monks remain still. They trust the walls. They trust the supplies. They trust each other. You remain there for a moment, listening to the storm slowly pass around the building. There is something strangely calming about the scene. The weather is fierce, but the people inside are peaceful, perhaps because they understand something modern life sometimes forgets. Nature does not need to be controlled to be survived. Sometimes it only needs to be respected. The frozen night continues. The storm moves across the landscape. The monastery stands quietly beneath the winter sky, and inside the sleeping hall, surrounded by stone and silence. The monks continue their long winter rest. The storm outside begins to lose some of its strength, but the cold remains wrapped around the monastery like a heavy cloak. You stay inside the sleeping hall and notice that the greatest challenge of winter is not always the dramatic moments of wind and snow. Often, it is the quiet persistence of the cold that people must face hour after hour. The monastery is still standing. The monks are still resting, but winter has not disappeared. You look around the sleeping hall and begin to appreciate the small comforts that make this place livable. The room is not warm in the way modern people imagine warmth. There is no gentle flow of heated air. There is no perfect temperature. Instead, comfort exists in small spaces and brief moments. A blanket feels warmer because the air is cold. A candle feels brighter because the room is dark. A shared room feels safer because the storm is outside. Medieval comfort was often created through contrast. You notice the texture of the materials around you. The wooden beams above have rough surfaces shaped by human hands. The blankets have weight and thickness. The stone walls feel ancient and permanent. Every material tells a story. Wood came from forests that required careful management. Wool came from animals that needed care. Stone came from labour and skill. Nothing appeared without effort. This relationship with materials shaped how medieval people viewed possessions. Objects were not easily replaced. They were maintained, repaired, and valued for as long as possible. A curious detail from medieval households and monasteries is that damaged clothing was often repaired repeatedly because fabric represented significant labour and expense. A small repair could extend the useful life of an important garment through many seasons. You imagine a monk examining a worn blanket during the day, noticing a damaged section, and repairing it before another winter night arrives. This simple action connects generations of people who depended on careful maintenance. The monastery survives through attention. Attention to buildings, attention to supplies, attention to the needs of people. You think about the design of the sleeping hall again at first. The shared space may seem uncomfortable, but during a freezing winter, it also creates advantages. A larger group gathered together can share warmth and monitor each other's well-being. The room represents a balance between sacrifice and practicality. The monks give up privacy. They gain community. They accept simplicity. They gain stability. Historians still argue how different medieval religious communities understood personal comfort because surviving writings often emphasize discipline and spiritual goals rather than emotional experiences. The physical reality of daily life must often be reconstructed from limited clues. You imagine how a monk might describe this room. He may not focus on the cold stone or simple bedding. He might describe the sense of belonging, the familiar voices, and the peaceful routine. Comfort is not always measured by softness. Sometimes it is measured by security. The storm outside continues quietly. The monastery walls block much of the wind, but the building still feels connected to the frozen landscape. Winter is present in the sounds, the temperature, and the pace of life. You notice how slowly everything moves. There is no rush. The night encourages patience. In the medieval world, waiting was a larger part of life. People waited for weather to change. They waited for seasons to turn. They waited for journeys to become possible again. Modern life often moves quickly, but this monastery exists in a slower rhythm. The monks cannot command the sunrise to arrive sooner. They cannot hurry winter away. They can only rest, prepare, and wait. You listen to the quiet sounds around you. The breathing of the sleeping monks creates a gentle pattern. The occasional movement of fabric reminds you that these are real people, not distant figures frozen in history. They are experiencing this night just as you are imagining it. They feel the cold. They hear the storm. They wait for morning. The monastery reveals something important about human resilience. Strength is not always dramatic. It is often found in routines repeated over and over again. A person gathering supplies before winter. A person maintaining a fire. A person repairing clothing. A person creating shelter. These actions seem ordinary, but they allow communities to survive. You look toward the dark corners of the sleeping hall and imagine all the winter nights that came before this one. Generations of monks experienced similar evenings. Different faces, different years, the same struggle against cold. The monastery became a place where knowledge was preserved. Not only written knowledge, practical knowledge, how to store food, how to maintain buildings, how to live together, how to rest through difficult seasons. This knowledge passed quietly from one generation to the next. The storm outside gradually becomes softer. The wind no longer dominates the night. The monastery feels calmer. The monks remain beneath their blankets. The walls remain firm. The sleeping hall remains a small refuge in the frozen world. You realize that the true comfort of this place does not come from defeating winter. It comes from understanding winter. The monks know what the cold can do. They know what they need. They know how to endure. And as the final hours before dawn approach, the monastery rests peacefully beneath the winter sky, protected by stone, tradition, and the quiet strength of the people inside. The night inside the monastery has become quieter now, and you remain beside the sleeping hall as the frozen hours slowly move toward morning. The storm has weakened, but the cold still surrounds the building. The monks continue resting beneath their blankets, carrying the weight of another winter night in the year 1268. You begin to think about the dreams filling this dark room. Sleep is not only a physical experience, it is also a window into the thoughts, fears, and hopes of the people who lived here. The monks sleeping around you were shaped by a world where faith, nature, and daily survival were deeply connected. Their dreams belonged to the medieval world. You imagine one monk lying quietly beneath a heavy wool covering. His breathing is slow. His hands rest near his body for warmth. Perhaps his thoughts drift back to the activities of the day. Perhaps he remembers a passage he studied, a conversation he shared, or a task waiting for him tomorrow. The human mind does not stop being active simply because the body rests. People in 1268 experienced dreams much like people today. They remembered places, faces, emotions, and events. The difference was how those dreams were understood. In medieval Europe, dreams were often connected with spiritual beliefs. Some people believed dreams could contain warnings, lessons, or reflections of the soul. Others saw them as connected to physical conditions, emotions, or daily experiences. A dream after a long winter day might include familiar images: a field, a church, a family member, a distant journey, a place of comfort. You look around the sleeping hall and realize that every person here carries a private world inside their mind. The shared room contains many individuals, each experiencing the night differently. The monastery may be communal, but dreams remain personal. A curious detail from medieval thought is that some religious writers created discussions about dreams and their meanings, attempting to understand whether certain dreams had spiritual importance or ordinary causes. These ideas reveal how seriously people consider the mysterious moments of sleep. The monks are surrounded by silence, but their minds are not empty. You hear the gentle sounds of the monastery around you. A wooden beam shifts as the temperature changes. The wind brushes against the outer walls. Somewhere nearby, a small fire gives a final crackle before settling lower. The sounds become part of the sleeping experience. For people in the medieval world, nighttime was filled with natural sounds that many modern sleepers rarely hear. There were no distant engines, electronic devices, or artificial noises covering the environment. The world was quieter, but it was also more noticeable. Every sound had meaning. A strange noise outside might suggest weather changing. A movement in the building might suggest someone working. A bell might signal a moment of prayer. The night was something people listened to. Historians still argue about how medieval people personally experienced nighttime thoughts and dreams because private writings from ordinary individuals are limited. Much of what is known comes from religious texts and educated writers, which may not represent everyone's experiences. You return your attention to the monks sleeping nearby. Their dreams are invisible, but their surroundings tell the story. The simple beds, the cold air, and the shared room all influence the way they experience rest. Even dreams are connected to the physical world. A person sleeping in a warm room may dream differently from someone aware of winter pressing against the walls. The environment shapes the mind. You imagine a monk dreaming of sunlight after weeks of cold weather. Perhaps he sees green fields and bright skies. Perhaps his mind creates warmth when his body cannot find enough of it. The longing for comfort is timeless. People have always imagined better conditions during difficult moments. The monastery teaches this quietly. Winter is temporary. Night is temporary. Hardship is temporary. The monks know that morning will eventually arrive. You notice the peaceful expression of the sleeping hall. There is no dramatic struggle happening now. The difficult work was completed earlier. The supplies were prepared. The walls were maintained. The blankets were arranged. Now comes the reward: rest. This moment reveals an important part of medieval life. Survival was not only about enduring hardship, it was also about creating moments of peace within that hardship. A warm meal, a shared prayer, a familiar room, a quiet night. These small experiences mattered. The monastery did not provide perfect comfort, but it provided something meaningful. It provided stability in an uncertain world. Outside, the frozen landscape remains unchanged. Snow covers the paths. The trees stand silently, the fields wait beneath the cold. Inside, the monks continue dreaming. Their lives are separated from yours by centuries. Yet the experience of lying awake for a moment during the night remains familiar. The desire for safety, warmth, and peace belongs to every generation. You remain still and listen. The sleeping hall breathes softly. The candles are almost gone. The monastery waits. Soon, the first signs of morning will begin to appear. The monks will wake and return to their routines. The quiet world of dreams will fade into another day of work, prayer, and preparation. But for now, the frozen night belongs to sleep. The stone walls protect the room. The blankets hold their warmth. The monk rests beneath the ancient roof, and the dreams of 1268 quietly pass through the darkness. The first faint signs of morning are still far away, and you remain inside the monastery as the final hours of darkness continue. The monks sleep quietly, but the cold night has reminded everyone inside this stone building that winter is not only a season, it is a constant presence shaping every decision, every habit, and every moment of rest. You begin to notice another reality of medieval winter life. Cold was not only uncomfortable, it could affect health. A frozen night tested the body. A long winter tested the community. The monks resting in the sleeping hall are protected by their surroundings, but they're not immune to the challenges of the season. Their clothing, food, shelter, and routines all help them face conditions that could become dangerous without preparation. You feel the cool air moving through the room. The stone walls remain cold beneath the darkness. The smell of wool and wood continues to fill the hall. Everything around you reminds you that this is a place where survival depends on careful habits. The medieval understanding of health was very different from modern ideas. People did not know about many causes of illness that are understood today. Instead, they explained the body through theories connected with balance, environment, and personal habits. These beliefs influenced how people responded to sickness. Monasteries often became places where knowledge about plants, care practices, and healing traditions was preserved. Monks copied texts, studied earlier writings, and maintained collections of information that could help their communities. A curious detail from medieval religious communities is that some monasteries cultivated gardens containing plants used for practical purposes, including food, remedies, and daily needs. These gardens connected the community closely with the natural world around them. You imagine a monastery garden during winter. The ground is quiet. Many plants are dormant beneath the frozen surface. The work done during warmer months continues providing value even when snow covers the landscape. Preparation once again becomes the hidden theme of survival. The monks sleeping peacefully tonight are benefiting from decisions made months earlier. Food was stored. Buildings were repaired. Supplies were collected. Knowledge was preserved. Winter rewards preparation. It punishes carelessness. You look toward the sleeping monks and think about how illness might affect such a close community. When many people share spaces, everyone's well-being becomes connected. One person's struggle can influence the entire group. This is one reason monasteries valued routines of cleanliness, order, and organization. These practices helped communities manage daily life. Even though medieval people did not understand health in the same way modern science does, historians still argue how effective medieval monastic care systems were, because surviving records often describe successful examples more clearly than ordinary failures. The evidence shows important traditions of care, but the exact experiences of individuals remain difficult to measure. You listen again to the quiet sleeping hall. A person coughs softly. A blanket shifts. Someone changes position. Small signs of human life continue through the darkness. The monks are not statues inside an ancient building. They are people with tired bodies, personal concerns, and ordinary physical needs. They feel the winter. They respond to it. They continue. You imagine a monk waking after a difficult night. Perhaps he feels stiff from the cold. Perhaps he needs extra time before beginning the morning routine. The monastery schedule provides structure, but real people always experience life differently. Rules create order. Reality creates adaptation. This balance existed everywhere in medieval society. The monastery was disciplined, but it was not frozen in its place. People adjusted according to circumstances. A harsh storm, illness, or shortage could change the normal rhythm. The ability to adapt was one of the greatest strengths of medieval communities. You think about the sleeping hall again. The room may appear simple, but it represents many forms of protection. The roof protects against snow. The walls protect against wind. The blankets protect against cold. The community protects against isolation. Each layer adds another form of security. Outside, the winter landscape remains silent. The storm has passed, but the frozen air still surrounds the monastery. The roads remain difficult. The fields remain asleep. Morning will arrive slowly. Inside, the monks continue resting. There is something peaceful about this moment. The night has been difficult, but it has also been successful. The community has endured another frozen evening. No great battle was fought. No famous event occurred. Yet this ordinary night represents thousands of similar experiences throughout history. People woke, people worked, people prepared, people rested, people endured. You begin to understand that social history often lives in these quiet moments. The way people slept reveals what they valued, what they feared, and how they adapted to their environment. A bed tells a story. A blanket tells a story. A cold room tells a story. The monastery itself becomes a record of human determination. The monks will eventually rise. They will return to prayer, work, and the responsibilities of another day. The sleeping hall will become active again. The same room that held dreams during the night will hold movement and conversation after sunrise. But for now, the monastery remains peaceful. The cold remains outside. The people remain sheltered. The final hours of darkness pass slowly beneath the ancient roof, and as the monks continue their winter rest, you see that surviving the night was never about defeating the cold. It was about living wisely within it. The darkness above the monastery slowly begins to change. Though the sun has not yet appeared, you remain inside the sleeping hall, watching the quiet transition between night and morning. The frozen hours are almost complete, and the monks who rested beneath their blankets will soon return to the routines that have shaped their lives for generations. The night has revealed something important. Sleep was not an escape from medieval life. It was part of medieval life. You look around the room one final time before morning arrives. The sleeping hall that seemed cold and unfamiliar at the beginning now feels strangely comforting. You understand its purpose, You understand why people accepted these conditions. The room was not designed for luxury, it was designed for belonging, protection, and endurance. The first faint sounds of movement begin to appear. A monk shifts beneath his blanket. Someone quietly prepares clothing. A wooden object moves somewhere in the distance. The monastery is waking. Morning in a medieval monastery did not arrive suddenly. It came gradually through small signs. The darkness slowly weakened. Candles were replaced by daylight. Sleeping spaces became active again. You imagine the monks rising from their simple beds. The air is still cold, the floor is still hard, and the stone walls still carry the memory of the winter night. But the people are ready. They have rested. They have recovered. They begin again. This daily cycle was one of the strongest features of monastic life. The same routines repeated through different seasons, creating a sense of stability. Winter might change the difficulty of tasks, but it did not completely change the rhythm. You notice how the sleeping hall transforms after rest ends. The space that held quiet dreams becomes a place of preparation. Blankets are folded. Clothing is arranged. People begin moving through the room with familiar purpose. A curious detail from medieval communities is that many objects were designed to serve several purposes because resources were limited. Furniture, rooms, and tools often had practical flexibility rather than being created for only one use. The sleeping hall itself reflects this idea. It's a place for rest, but it is also part of the larger system that supports the monastery. You think about the night that has passed. The monks faced cold temperatures, darkness, and the sounds of the storm, yet they also experienced companionship, routine, and shelter. The night contained both difficulty and comfort. This balance defines much of medieval life. Historians still debate how people from different medieval regions personally experienced winter because climate, wealth, architecture, and local traditions varied greatly. A monastery in one area might have felt very different from another community elsewhere. There was no single medieval winter experience. There were thousands, each shaped by geography and human choices. You walk mentally through the monastery as the morning begins. The kitchen becomes active again. Fires are prepared. Supplies are checked. The sounds of work return to the corridors. The smell of smoke grows stronger. The scent of food begins appearing again. The building slowly fills with life. The monks who slept through the frozen night are now part of another day. Their survival depended on the simple things they did repeatedly. They maintained their clothing. They cared for their surroundings. They followed routines. Nothing dramatic, nothing heroic in the usual sense. These actions allowed life to continue. You realize that endurance often looks ordinary when viewed closely. A person waking up after a cold night. A person preparing breakfast. A person repairing a damaged item. A person completing a familiar task. These moments rarely appear in stories about the Middle Ages, but they reveal how people actually lived. The monastery teaches a quiet lesson about resilience. Strength is not always found in grand achievements. Sometimes it is found in patience. The patience to wait through winter. The patience to maintain traditions. The patience to accept conditions that cannot be changed. You look toward the windows as the first light begins touching the frozen landscape outside. The storm has left signs of its presence. Snow covers parts of the ground. The air remains sharp. The world appears still. But morning has arrived. The monastery has survived another night. Inside the sleeping hall, the evidence of the night remains. Folded blankets, quiet footsteps, the memory of shared warmth. The space carries the story of everyone who rested there. A room can reveal a civilization. The sleeping hall reveals a society built around cooperation. It reveals a world where comfort came from preparation. It reveals people who understood their environment because they lived closely with it. You think about the monks who slept here centuries ago. Their names may be forgotten. Their individual stories may have disappeared. Yet the simple act of resting through a winter night connects them with everyone who has ever searched for safety after a long day. The desire for rest is universal. The search for shelter is universal. The hope for a peaceful morning is universal. The monks begin their new day. The monastery awakens. The frozen night becomes a memory. And the ancient stone walls continue standing, holding the stories of countless winter evenings that came before and after this one. The monastery has awakened from the frozen night, but you remain with the memory of the hours that passed beneath the ancient roof. The morning light slowly enters the halls, touching the same stones that held the cold darkness only a short time before. The monks have returned to their duties, yet the story of the night remains hidden within the quiet spaces around them. You look back at the sleeping hall and see it differently now. At first, it appeared simple, cold, uncomfortable, almost impossible. But after spending the night inside this medieval world, you understand that simplicity does not mean weakness. The sleeping hall was a reflection of the society that created it. It showed what people valued, what they feared, and how they adapted. The room tells a story. The blankets tell a story. The walls tell a story. Every detail reveals something about life in 1268. You walk through the monastery as the morning routine begins. The sounds have returned. Footsteps move across stone floors. Doors open. Voices become louder. Fires are prepared. The building that seemed asleep only moments ago now feels alive again. The same rooms that protected people through the night now support another day of activity. This constant movement between work and rest shaped medieval communities. Life followed cycles, day followed night, winter followed summer. Labour followed recovery. People depended on these rhythms because nature controlled so much of their existence. You notice how the monastery represents a larger idea about medieval society. It was not a place where people escaped the challenges of life. It was a place where people organized themselves to face those challenges together. The cold winter night did not disappear because the monks entered a monastery. The monastery simply gave them better tools to endure it. The tools were not always physical. Some were social, community, routine, shared responsibility. Others were practical, clothing, food storage, architecture, knowledge. Together, these created resilience. A curious detail from medieval religious communities is that monasteries often became centres where agricultural knowledge, written traditions, and practical skills were preserved alongside spiritual teachings. Their role extended beyond prayer because they were connected to the wider needs of the communities around them. You imagine the workers and monks continuing their morning tasks after the difficult night. Someone checks supplies, someone prepares food, someone cleans and organizes shared spaces. The same careful attention that protected people during sleep continues throughout the day. The monastery survives through repetition, not through one great moment, not through one perfect invention, through countless small actions. Historians still debate how much comfort medieval people expected from their living spaces because ideas of comfort change across time and culture. What seems harsh today may have felt normal, practical, or even secure to people living in the 13th century. You consider this carefully. A person does not measure comfort only by softness. Comfort can also mean familiarity. A familiar room, a familiar routine, familiar voices nearby. The monks sleeping in the dormitory may not have experienced the space as uncomfortable in the same way a modern visitor might. They understood the environment because they belonged to it. They knew the sounds. They knew the seasons. They knew what to expect. This connection between people and place was one of the defining features of medieval life. You step closer to the monastery windows and imagine the landscape outside. The fields remain frozen, but they will eventually change. The snow will melt, the ground will soften, the cycle of farming will begin again. Winter is never permanent. The monks know this. Their patience comes from understanding seasons. The cold night was difficult, but it was temporary. The same people who endured frozen darkness would later experience warmer days, longer sunlight, and new growth. Life moved in cycles. The monastery existed within a society. You think about the larger meaning of this single night. It was only one evening among many. Thousands of people across medieval Europe experienced similar nights in castles, villages, farms, and religious communities. Most of those nights were never recorded. Most of those people were never famous, yet their experiences built the foundation of everyday history. The way people slept tells us about their society. It tells us about technology. It tells us about relationships. It tells us about human creativity. A bed is not just a place to rest. It is a reflection of the world around it. The monks of 1268 slept beneath simple blankets because their world provided simple solutions. But those solutions were not meaningless. They represented centuries of adaptation and knowledge. You return once more to the sleeping hall in your imagination. The room is empty now, waiting for another night. The blankets will return. The candles will burn again. The wind will come back against the walls. Another winter evening will arrive. And the monastery will respond in the same way, with preparation, with patience, with community. The story of this frozen night is not only about cold temperatures or medieval buildings, it is about people finding ways to create comfort in conditions they could not control. That lesson remains powerful. Every generation faces its own challenges. Every generation creates its own forms of shelter. Every generation searches for peace at the end of the day. The monks of 1268 found theirs beneath a stone roof, surrounded by familiar voices and the quiet strength of their community. The morning continues, the monastery continues, and the memory of the frozen night slowly becomes another part of the long human story written across history. The winter night inside the monastery has passed. but you remain surrounded by the echoes of everything that happened beneath the ancient stone roof. The frozen wind has moved away, the candles have disappeared, the sleeping hall has returned to ordinary activity, yet the memory of those quiet hours remains, revealing a world that was both distant and surprisingly familiar. You have followed the monks through preparation, darkness, rest, and mourning. You have seen that sleeping in a medieval monastery was never only about finding a place to close your eyes. It was about creating a small island of comfort inside a world shaped by seasons, weather, and uncertainty. The monastery of 1268 was not a place without hardship. It was a place built around endurance. You look again at the thick walls surrounding the community. They are cold, strong, and imperfect. They did not remove winter from people's lives. They simply gave people a place where winter could be faced together. That may be the greatest lesson hidden inside this frozen night. Human beings have always searched for shelter. Not only shelter from weather, shelter from uncertainty, shelter from loneliness, shelter from the unknown. The monks found that shelter through their community, their traditions, and the careful systems they created over generations. You think about the sleeping hall where dozens of people rested together. To modernize, it may seem uncomfortable, it may seem unfamiliar, but within its own time, it represented something important. Nobody faced the night alone. The cold air entered the building. The wind continued outside. The darkness covered the landscape. But within those walls, people shared the same space and the same experience. A quiet form of strength existed there. The strength of cooperation. The strength of routine. The strength of simply continuing. Medieval history is often remembered through rulers, wars, and grand events. But the ordinary moments reveal another kind of story. A person arranging a blanket, a worker carrying firewood, a cook preparing food, a monk walking through a dark corridor. These moments may seem small, but they created the foundation of everyday life. Historians still argue about many details of medieval sleeping habits because surviving records rarely capture the full personal experiences of ordinary people. Written sources often describe rules, buildings, and religious practices, but they cannot fully reveal what every person felt during a cold winter night. The uncertainty itself reminds you that history is always incomplete. There are gaps. There are unanswered questions. There are silent voices. Yet even with those gaps, the evidence allows you to imagine the human experience. You can imagine the feeling of pulling a wool blanket closer. You can imagine hearing the wind beyond the walls. You can imagine the relief of waking after a difficult night and seeing morning light return. These experiences connect the past with the present. The monks of 1268 lived in a different world, but they shared the same basic needs that people carry today. They needed rest. They needed safety. They needed belonging. They needed moments of peace. The monastery provided those things in a way shaped by its own time. Its comfort came from stone walls instead of modern heating. Its light came from candles instead of electric lamps. Its warmth came from clothing, food, fire, and community. The methods were different. The purpose was the same. You imagine the monastery at sunset once more. Another winter evening arrives. The same corridors become quiet. The same halls fill with shadows. The same routines begin again. Someone prepares the sleeping space. Someone maintains the fire. Someone closes the doors against the wind. The cycle continues. This repetition is what made survival possible. The monks did not survive one winter night through a single heroic action. They survived because they had learned how to live with winter every day. They understood the land. They understood their resources. They understood each other, and that understanding allowed them to rest. The frozen night outside was powerful, but the human response inside those walls was equally powerful, not because it defeated nature, but because it respected nature and adapted to it. You leave the monastery slowly in your imagination. The stone corridors fade behind you. The sleeping hall becomes quieter. The sound of the winter wind becomes softer in the distance. The people who rested there are gone. The candles have burned away. The blankets have disappeared. But the story remains. A single winter night in 1268 reveals something timeless about humanity. Across centuries, people have searched for warmth in cold places, light in darkness, and peace at the end of difficult days. The monastery stands as a reminder that comfort has many forms. Sometimes comfort is a warm room. Sometimes it is a familiar voice nearby. Sometimes it is simply knowing that others are sharing the same night with you. And now, as the memory of the frozen monastery slowly fades, you can imagine the quiet halls resting once again beneath the winter sky. The wind moves gently across the fields. The old stones remain still. The world becomes peaceful. The night grows softer. The monastery grows quieter. The story comes to rest. As the final images of the monastery disappear, you imagine the last candle glowing gently against the stone walls. The winter wind becomes a distant whisper, and the sleeping hall returns to silence. The monks rest beneath their simple blankets, protected by tradition, community, and the quiet strength of generations before them. The frozen night has passed, leaving only calm memories behind. Now, allow your thoughts to slow, your surroundings to soften, and your imagination to drift gently through the peaceful halls of history.